A man who dismissed the Force as superstition arrived in a galaxy where it decided the fate of empires. Lex Luthor brought with him a mind sharp enough to dissect alien gods and the arrogance to believe that intellect could shatter prophecy itself. The Emperor saw potential, Vader saw threat. And somewhere beneath Coruscant's towers, weapons were being born that could kill not just worlds, but the very fabric of destiny. When genius meets mysticism, when science challenges the ancient current that flows through all living things, who decides which power deserves to rule the stars? The Republic had fallen, and in its place rose an empire built on order, fear, and the promise of stability through absolute control. Across 1,000 systems, the Emperor's will became law, enforced by legions of stormtroopers and the dark specter of his enforcer, Darth Vader. Yet beneath the surface of this new galactic order, ambition still simmered, and power remained a prize sought by those cunning enough to seize it without invoking the Emperor's wrath. In the gleaming towers of Coruscant, where senators once debated the fate of worlds, a new kind of player entered the game. He arrived not through hyperspace lanes charted by the Republic, but through a tear in reality itself, a wound between dimensions that closed as quickly as it opened. His name was Lex Luthor, and he brought with him an intellect that would challenge the very foundation upon which the Empire was built. He dismissed the Force as superstition, prophecy as the chains of the weak, and destiny as a lie told to those afraid to claim their own futures. The galaxy would learn that some threats wore suits instead of armor, and some weapons cut deeper than any lightsaber. The dimensional rift opened above Coruscant at the height of the galactic day, when 5 suns painted the sky in shades of amber and gold. No alarms sounded, no sensors detected the intrusion. One moment, the air above the Senate district shimmered with the ordinary traffic of repulsor-lift vehicles and cargo transports, and the next, a figure fell through a crack in space itself, tumbling through 300 meters of open sky before deploying technology that should not have existed. Anti-gravity fields pulsed from devices integrated into a suit of green and purple armor, slowing the descent to something survivable. Lex Luthor landed on a platform reserved for high-ranking Imperial officials, his boots striking durasteel with a resonance that sent maintenance droids scattering. He straightened, taking in his surroundings with the calculating gaze of a man who had conquered empires before and would do so again. The guards arrived within seconds. 8 stormtroopers with blaster rifles raised and voices barking commands through helmet speakers. Lex raised his hands slowly, the gesture one of compliance rather than surrender. His armor retracted into subcutaneous storage, nanomachines pulling back to reveal a perfectly tailored suit beneath, immaculate despite his journey through the void. He studied the weapons pointed at him with clinical interest, noting the plasma containment mechanisms, the Tabana gas cartridges, the crude but effective design philosophy. This civilization had achieved interstellar travel, energy weapons, and artificial gravity, yet their approach remained frustratingly organic, reliant on beings rather than pure automation. The inefficiency offended him on a fundamental level. The stormtroopers led him through corridors of polished stone and burnished metal, past holographic displays showing star systems bowing beneath the Empire's banner. Lex absorbed every detail, constructing a mental framework of this new reality with each passing meter. The architecture spoke of grandiosity married to function, of a government that valued spectacle as much as substance. He noted the presence of security cameras, scanning arrays, biometric checkpoints, all technologies he recognized despite their alien configuration. These people understood surveillance, control, the machinery of authoritarian rule. That would make certain aspects of his plan more challenging, but not impossible. Nothing was impossible for a mind like his. They brought him before Mas Amedda in a chamber designed to intimidate through sheer scale. The Chagrian stood on a raised platform, his blue skin catching the light from windows that offered a view of Coruscant's endless cityscape. The Empire's Grand Vizier examined the stranger with eyes that had witnessed the Republic's death and calculated the profit in every political maneuver since. Lex met that gaze without flinching, reading the intelligence behind it, the ambition barely restrained by protocol. This was a man who served power because he understood that proximity to it offered its own rewards. This was someone Lex could work with. "You arrive unannounced," Maz Amedda said, his voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic authority. "You bypass our orbital defenses. You land in restricted space. Explain yourself before I have you executed for espionage." Lex smiled, the expression calculated to convey confidence without arrogance, capability without threat. "I am Lex Luthor, recently displaced from my own dimension by forces beyond even my considerable control. I find myself stranded in your galaxy, possessing knowledge and technology that could advance your empire decades beyond its current capabilities. I seek only the opportunity to contribute, to share what I know, and to find purpose in this new reality." He gestured to the city beyond the windows. "I've spent the last hour observing your civilization through passive sensors in my suit. You've achieved remarkable things, but you've barely scratched the surface of what's possible. I can help you reach it." Maz Amedda descended from his platform, circling Lex with the wariness of a predator assessing prey that might bite back. "We have the Emperor's wisdom to guide us. We have Lord Vader to enforce his will. What could you possibly offer that we lack?" "Efficiency," Lex said simply. "Your empire spans thousands of worlds, yet you rely on clones, conscripts, and organic administrators to maintain control. Every biological component introduces variables, emotion, fatigue, loyalty that wavers under pressure. I can show you how to build systems that never tire, never doubt, never betray. I can revolutionize your weapons, your ships, your infrastructure. I can make the Empire truly unstoppable, not through mysticism or fear, but through the application of pure, rational science." The word mysticism hung in the air like a challenge. Maz Amedda's eyes narrowed slightly, and Lex knew he had struck the nerve he intended to find. He had observed the references to something called the Force during his descent, seen the fear in people's faces when they spoke of Vader, the religious fervor that infected even supposedly rational institutions. This galaxy believed in magic, worshipped power they couldn't understand, and built their entire hierarchy on the shoulders of space wizards. It was primitive, it was exploitable. Maz Amedda studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the guards. "Confine him to the guest quarters in the administrative tower. He is to be monitored at all times. I will consult with the Emperor regarding his fate." The Chagrian leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If you are lying, if this is some elaborate plot by rebel sympathizers or forgotten Jedi conspirators, you will discover that the Empire's methods of interrogation are far more advanced than you imagine." "I welcome the examination," Lex replied. "I have nothing to hide and everything to offer." The quarters they assigned him were luxurious by the standards of a prison, comfortable by the standards of a hotel, and pathetically insecure by the standards of anyone who understood technology. Lex spent the first hour mapping the surveillance systems, identifying 17 separate monitoring devices ranging from standard visual recorders to exotic sensors that seemed designed to detect energy signatures he didn't recognize. He left them all active, knowing that his best defense lay not in secrecy, but in demonstrated value. Let them watch. Let them see a man working to help their empire succeed. Trust was a commodity he could manufacture given time and the right raw materials. He activated a holographic interface from his suit's reserve power, projecting schematics into the air above the room's central table. The technology that had brought him here was irreparable with local resources, but its principles remained sound. Dimensional mechanics, quantum probability manipulation, energy matrices that bent the laws of physics like clay in a sculptor's hands. If this galaxy possessed similar technology, he had seen no evidence of it. Their hyperspace travel appeared to rely on entering an alternate dimension rather than folding space itself. An elegant solution, but one that carried inherent limitations. He could improve on it. He could improve on everything he had seen. The door opened without warning, and Lex looked up to find himself facing a presence that made the air itself seem heavier. Darth Vader filled the doorway like a monument to war. Black armor reflecting the holographic light, breathing apparatus cycling with mechanical precision. The Dark Lord of the Sith stepped into the room, and Lex felt something brush against his mind, an invasive sensation like fingers probing the surface of his thoughts. Instinctively, he had prepared for this. His suit's neural shielding activated, generating a field that disrupted whatever force was attempting to penetrate his consciousness. It was crude protection, designed against telepathic attacks in his own universe, but it seemed to hold. Vader's breathing hitched, almost imperceptibly. "You resist the Force." "I resist intrusion," Lex corrected, standing slowly with his hands visible and empty. "Where I come from, telepathy is a violation. I've learned to defend against it." "No offense intended, Lord Vader. I simply value the privacy of my own mind." The Dark Lord circled him as Masameda had, but where the Chagrian's assessment had been political, Vader's carried the weight of something far more dangerous. Lex could feel the power radiating from the armored figure, not metaphorically but as an actual physical sensation, like standing near a reactor core. This was the source of their mysticism, then. This force they spoke of with such reverence, an energy field of some kind, possibly generated by biological processes, manipulated through meditation and training, impressive, but not magical. Nothing was truly magical. Everything could be understood, quantified, replicated, and ultimately controlled. "You do not fear me," Vader observed, and it was not quite a question. "I respect power," Lex said carefully. "I respect the position you hold and the authority you represent. But fear is a tool, Lord Vader, and I refuse to be anyone's tool. I've come here offering my services to the Empire. If that offering is unwelcome, then execute me and be done with it. But if you're intelligent, and I believe you are, you'll recognize that I represent an opportunity your Empire cannot afford to ignore." Vader's hand moved to his belt, and Lex tracked the motion with perfect clarity. The weapon hanging there was elegantly simple, a cylinder of metal that likely contained a plasma blade held in magnetic containment. Lightsaber. He had heard it called during his observation. Weapons for more civilized times. According to some fragment of overheard conversation, weapons for religious warriors who believed themselves guardians of peace. Vader was no guardian. Vader was an executioner, and his weapon reflected that truth. "The Emperor is curious about you," Vader said after a moment. "He senses no deception in your words, yet finds your presence troubling. You arrive at a time of transition, when the last remnants of the old order still cling to power in the shadows. Coincidence rarely occurs in matters of galactic importance." "I'm not with any rebellion," Lex stated flatly. "I've observed enough to understand the political landscape. Your empire rose from the ashes of a failed republic, brought order to chaos, and established stability through strength. From a purely objective standpoint, that's admirable. My own world suffered through similar periods of transition. I learned long ago that fighting against the inevitable wastes resources better spent on innovation." He gestured to the holograms still floating in the air. "I want to build, Lord Vader. I want to create. Your empire provides the infrastructure and resources to do so on a scale I never achieved in my home dimension. All I ask is the opportunity to prove my worth." Vader approached the holographic schematics, studying them with what Lex assumed was careful attention behind that impassive mask. The Dark Lord's breathing filled the silence, a rhythm that never varied, evidence of extensive cybernetic life support. "Injured, then, badly enough to require permanent assistance, but not badly enough to diminish his effectiveness as the Emperor's enforcer. Interesting. That spoke to either remarkably advanced medical technology or this force energy sustaining him beyond normal biological limits, possibly both. Your designs propose improvements to our infrastructure, Vader said, yet you have been here mere hours. How can you claim to understand our technology well enough to enhance it? Because I understand the principles underlying all technology, Lex replied. Your hyperdrive systems, your repulsor lift engines, your energy weapons, they're all applications of fundamental physics. The specific implementation varies, but the core concepts remain universal. I've spent my life mastering those concepts, pushing them beyond what others believed possible. Given access to your technical databases and fabrication facilities, I could revolutionize your military capabilities within a standard year. Vader turned from the holograms, and Lex felt that invasive presence brush against his mind again, testing the neural shielding. The Force shows me your nature, Lex Luthor. You are ambitious. You are ruthless. You are driven by a need to prove your superiority over all others. These qualities can serve the Empire, or they can destroy you. The distinction will depend on whether you understand your place in the order we have established. I understand hierarchy, Lex said. I understand that power flows from the Emperor through you to the machinery of state. I have no desire to challenge that structure. I want to strengthen it, to make it so efficient and powerful that no force in this galaxy could threaten it. Surely that aligns with your goals. The Dark Lord was silent for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, his voice carrying back over the mechanical breathing. The Emperor will grant you limited access to our resources. You will work under constant supervision. You will be tested, evaluated, and scrutinized for any sign of treachery. If you prove valuable, your privileges will expand. If you prove dangerous, I will end your life with less thought than I give to crushing an insect. Do you understand these terms? Perfectly, Lex replied, allowing the smallest hint of satisfaction to color his voice. I won't disappoint you, Lord Vader. The door closed behind the Sith Lord, leaving Lex alone with his thoughts and the surveillance devices recording his every move. He returned to the holographic interface, refining his designs with fingers that moved with practiced precision. The game had begun. He had achieved his first objective, survival and conditional acceptance. Now came the slow work of demonstrating indispensability, of making himself so valuable that the Empire could not function without his contributions. He had done it before with LexCorp, building a technology empire that made him essential to Earth's infrastructure. He would do it again here, in a galaxy that worshipped mysticism over intellect. And when he had accumulated enough power, when he had woven himself so deeply into the Empire's foundations that removing him would cause systemic collapse, then he would begin the real work. He would prove that science trumped superstition, that rational minds accomplished more than mystical warriors, that the future belonged not to those blessed by cosmic forces, but to those brilliant enough to bend reality through sheer force of intellect. The Force was impressive. But Lex Luthor had built an empire fighting a god. He would not bow to space wizards, no matter how powerful they claimed to be. 6 weeks passed in what the Empire called a probationary period, and Lex used every moment to cement his value to the infrastructure of authoritarian rule. They assigned him to an Imperial research facility on Coruscant's industrial level, 300 stories below the gleaming towers where senators once debated the fate of the galaxy. The facility occupied a space the size of a small city, filled with laboratories, testing ranges, and fabrication equipment that could produce anything from microscopic circuits to capital ship components. It was crude by the standards of his home dimension, reliant on organic oversight and prone to inefficiencies that made him grind his teeth, but it represented resources he could leverage. His first project was deliberately modest, a refinement to the Stormtrooper armor that increased power cell efficiency by 17% while reducing overall weight by 3 kilograms. The improvement was minor in absolute terms, but significant when multiplied across millions of soldiers. Imperial logistics officers praised the innovation, and word spread through the military hierarchy that the off-world advisor understood practical applications rather than theoretical abstractions. Lex smiled at the designation. Let them think of him as a useful technician. Underestimation was a weapon he had wielded throughout his career. The second project targeted communications security, introducing an encryption algorithm based on quantum entanglement principles that made Imperial transmissions functionally unbreakable by current technology. The Military Intelligence Division celebrated the achievement, and suddenly Lex found himself invited to briefings previously restricted to high-level officers. He attended these meetings with careful humility, offering suggestions only when asked, demonstrating expertise without arrogance. He was patient. He had always been patient when the stakes justified it. The third project was where he began to push boundaries. He proposed a radical redesign of the TIE Fighter, the Empire's standard short-range attack craft. The existing models were effective but disposable, lacking shields, hyperdrives, and life support systems. Imperial doctrine treated them as expendable weapons, and their pilots accordingly. Lex found the waste philosophically offensive. A properly designed fighter would cost more initially, but provide exponentially greater return through enhanced survivability and versatility. He drafted specifications for a TIE Advanced prototype, incorporating shield generators, improved weapons systems, and flight characteristics that would make it superior to any Rebel starfighter currently in operation. The proposal reached Vader's attention within a day. The Dark Lord summoned Lex to a hangar where the first prototype was being assembled, a facility guarded by Death Troopers whose black armor and specialized equipment marked them as elite even by Imperial standards. Vader stood before the partially constructed fighter, cape hanging motionless in the recycled air, presence dominating the space like a collapsing star. "You presume to redesign our fighter core," Vader said without preamble. "I presume to improve efficiency," Lex corrected, approaching the prototype with the confidence of someone who knew his work exceeded scrutiny. "The current TIE model serves adequately against disorganized rebel cells, but against coordinated fighter wings or capital ship defenses, they're slaughtered. Your pilots die in percentages that would be considered unacceptable in any properly managed military. This design reduces casualties while increasing combat effectiveness. Surely that aligns with Imperial objectives." Vader circled the prototype, and Lex wondered what the Dark Lord saw when he looked at technology. Did he appreciate the elegance of the engineering, the precision required to balance power generation with mass distribution, or did he see only tools, weapons to be wielded against enemies of the state? The Sith was difficult to read behind that mask, and the neural shielding that protected Lex's thoughts also blocked any empathic feedback that might have given him insight into Vader's emotional state. "Your designs are effective," Vader acknowledged after a long silence, "but they represent a philosophy antithetical to Imperial doctrine. We value numbers over individual survivability. We achieve victory through overwhelming force rather than technological superiority. A philosophy that works until you face an enemy who values both," Lex countered, taking a calculated risk. "The rebellion survives because their starfighters outperform ours on an individual basis. They compensate for numerical disadvantage through superior equipment and pilot skill. If the Empire adopted similar principles while maintaining its numerical superiority, the war would end in months rather than years." Vader turned from the prototype to face him directly, and Lex felt the temperature in the hangar seemed to drop despite no actual change in environmental controls. "You speak boldly for someone whose loyalty remains unproven. The Emperor tolerates your presence because you have demonstrated value, but tolerance is not trust. Do not mistake our use of your services for acceptance into the Empire's inner circle." "I seek no circle," Lex replied, meeting the Dark Lord's gaze with unwavering focus. I seek only to fulfill my purpose as I understand it. I am a builder, Lord Vader. I create solutions to problems others consider insurmountable. If the Empire benefits from my work, then I've found meaning in a galaxy far from home. If my loyalty remains in question, then test it. Give me an objective you consider impossible and watch me achieve it. The Dark Lord was silent for a moment, breathing apparatus cycling with mechanical precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality Lex hadn't heard before, something almost approaching curiosity. You claim to dismiss the Force as superstition, yet you protected your mind from my initial probe. That suggests you acknowledge powers beyond your comprehension. I acknowledge abilities beyond my current understanding, Lex clarified. That's different from accepting them as supernatural. Everything can be explained, Lord Vader. Everything can be understood, replicated, improved. Your force is impressive, but it's not magic. It's an energy field of some kind, likely generated by symbiotic organisms or perhaps quantum fields that biological systems can manipulate through neurological processes evolved over millions of years. I don't understand the specific mechanisms yet, but I will. And when I do, I'll show you how to enhance it through technology rather than meditation. The silence that followed that statement stretched like a blade drawn across stone. Lex knew he had crossed into dangerous territory, challenging the foundational mythology of the Sith and their empire. But fear was a weakness he refused to indulge, and submission brought nothing but the contempt of those powerful enough to grant it. He had not survived encounters with Superman by cowering before superior force. He had survived by proving himself too valuable to destroy and too intelligent to dismiss. Vader raised one black-gloved hand, and Lex felt something seize him, an invisible pressure that wrapped around his body and lifted him from the ground. His neural shielding protected his mind, but did nothing against this physical manifestation of Force power. He hung suspended 3 meters above the hangar floor, the Dark Lord's hand outstretched in a gesture of casual dominance. There was no anger in the action, no rage or hatred. It was a demonstration, a reminder of the hierarchy Vader had referenced in their first meeting. The Force is not a tool to be studied and replicated, Vader said, voice carrying across the hangar with perfect clarity. It is the foundation of reality itself, the binding energy that connects all living things. Your technology is meaningless before its power. Your intellect, however formidable, cannot comprehend what lies beyond the material realm. Remember this the next time you speak of understanding what you cannot sense. The invisible grip released, and Lex dropped back to the deck with more grace than Vader likely anticipated. He had experienced similar attacks from metahumans in his own dimension, learned to fall correctly, to minimize injury, to recover quickly. He straightened his suit with deliberate calm, meeting Vader's gaze without the submission the Dark Lord clearly expected. I remember everything, Lord Vader. That's what makes me dangerous. Vader studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked from the hangar without another word. Lex watched him go, analyzing the encounter with the same clinical precision he applied to all interactions with power. Vader had demonstrated superiority through the Force, established physical dominance, reinforced the existing hierarchy. But he had also revealed something important. The Dark Lord was curious about him, not suspicious, not dismissive, but genuinely interested in someone who challenged the philosophical foundations of Sith doctrine. That curiosity could be cultivated, shaped, exploited. Lex returned to his work on the prototype, fingers flying across the holographic interface with renewed focus. The Force was impressive. But throughout history, impressive powers had been challenged, analyzed, and ultimately conquered by those intelligent enough to find the pattern beneath the phenomenon. He had 6 months, perhaps a year, before his position within the imperial hierarchy solidified enough to pursue more ambitious projects. Until then, He would be the loyal technician, the useful advisor, the man who made the Empire stronger through science rather than mysticism. And he would learn. Every interaction with Vader, every reference to the Force in technical documents, every scrap of information about Jedi and Sith would be absorbed, categorized, and integrated into his growing understanding of this galaxy's fundamental rules. The Force might be beyond his current comprehension, but nothing remained beyond him forever. He had decoded Kryptonian biology, reversed engineered technology from 100 alien civilizations, built weapons that threatened gods. He would decode this too, given time and resources. The question was not whether he could understand the Force. The question was what he would do with that understanding when he finally achieved it. 3 months into his tenure with the Empire, Lex received clearance to attend a strategy session in the Emperor's personal tower. The invitation came without warning, delivered by an Imperial courier whose deference suggested the opportunity represented significant recognition. Lex accepted with appropriate humility, then spent the next 2 hours preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most consequential meeting of his time in this galaxy. He reviewed everything he had learned about the Empire's current strategic challenges, identified 3 proposals that would address their most pressing concerns, and practiced delivering them with precisely calibrated confidence. The tower rose from Coruscant's highest peak, a spire of dark metal that dominated the skyline like a monument to authoritarian ambition. Security became more intense with each ascending level. Scanners probing for weapons, explosives, and signatures Lex didn't recognize. His neural shielding triggered at every checkpoint, and he explained it each time as a medical necessity, a cybernetic implant required to manage a neurological condition from his home dimension. The guards accepted the explanation but recorded it carefully, adding another note to his growing file. The strategy chamber occupied the tower's pinnacle, a circular room with walls of transparent steel offering a view of the planet city stretching to every horizon. A dozen officers stood around a holographic display showing the galaxy in miniature, stars connected by hyperspace lanes, systems marked in Imperial white or Rebel red. Mas Amedda stood at the table's head, blue skin almost luminous in the projected starlight, voice carrying the weight of unquestioned authority. Other figures Lex recognized from intelligence briefings, admirals, generals, sector governors, all men and women who had risen through military or political competence, and standing in shadow at the room's far edge, Darth Vader watched the proceedings with the stillness of a predator confident in its dominance. Lex entered with measured steps, acknowledging Mas Amedda with a respectful nod before taking his position at the table's outer ring. He was not yet important enough to stand among the inner circle, but his presence here at all represented significant progress. He listened as officers reported on rebel activities, discussed resource allocation, debated the merits of various strategic initiatives. The conversation was intelligent but constrained by conventional thinking, bound by doctrines that valued overwhelming force over surgical precision. The rebellion persists because we cannot locate their primary base, one admiral argued, gesturing to a dozen systems highlighted in red. They strike from hidden locations, then scatter before our forces can respond. We need better intelligence, faster response times, and more efficient deployment of our fleet assets. Or we need to make their hiding irrelevant, Lex said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the chamber. Every eye turned to him, and he felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. Mas Amedda's expression remained neutral, but Lex detected a flicker of interest behind those calculating eyes. Vader remained motionless in the shadows, breathing apparatus the only sound in the sudden silence. "Explain," Mas Amedda commanded. Lex stepped forward to the holographic display, highlighting 3 systems with gestures that manipulated the interface. The rebellion survives through mobility. They treat the galaxy as an ocean, hiding in its vastness, emerging only to strike and retreat. Traditional doctrine suggests hunting them system by system, an approach that will take decades and cost trillions of credits. I propose an alternative. Instead of searching for their base, make its location irrelevant by creating a weapon that can destroy entire star systems regardless of their strategic value. Demonstrate such power once, and the rebellion collapses not through military defeat, but through the psychological realization that nowhere is safe. The silence deepened, taking on a quality that made the air itself seem heavier. Lex knew he had introduced something radical, something that would either elevate him to the inner circle or mark him as dangerously unstable. He waited, letting his proposal settle into the minds of strategists trained to think in terms of fleets and armies, rather than existential weapons. "You speak of genocide," an admiral said finally, voice carrying more curiosity than outrage. "The destruction of entire systems, billions of lives erased to make a point." "I speak of strategic efficiency," Lex corrected. "The Empire already possesses weapons capable of destroying planets. Base Delta Zero protocols reduce worlds to molten slag through sustained orbital bombardment. I propose refining that capability into a single weapon of such overwhelming power that its mere existence ends resistance. One demonstration, carefully chosen for maximum psychological impact, achieves what decades of conventional warfare cannot. It's not genocide, if the alternative is a prolonged conflict that kills billions through attrition." Mas Ameda circled the table, studying the holographic galaxy with renewed interest. Such a weapon would require resources beyond conventional military budgets. The Emperor would need to authorize a project of unprecedented scale. "The Emperor already has." Vader's voice cut through the chamber like a blade drawn from its sheath. The Dark Lord emerged from the shadows, approaching the holographic display with steps that seemed to compress the very space around him. "The Death Star project proceeds according to schedule. Within 2 years, it will become operational, a battle station with firepower sufficient to destroy entire planets with a single shot. Your proposal, Lex Luthor, merely echoes designs already in progress." Lex controlled his expression carefully, not allowing surprise or disappointment to show on his face. They were already building his idea, had been building it for years, and he had just revealed his strategic thinking without gaining any unique value from the revelation. A mistake, a rare miscalculation brought on by incomplete information, and the arrogance of assuming his intellect automatically placed him ahead of local development. He adjusted his approach with the speed that had allowed him to survive boardroom warfare on Earth. "Then my value lies not in conception but in optimization," he said smoothly. "I've had 6 months to study Imperial technology. I've identified 17 potential vulnerabilities in standard Imperial design philosophy, from power distribution inefficiencies to structural weaknesses in reactor shielding. If your Death Star follows conventional patterns, it likely contains similar flaws. Grant me access to the project's technical specifications, and I'll ensure it becomes truly invulnerable." Vader approached until he stood directly across the holographic display from Lex, separated by light years of projected star space. "The Death Star's design is the most closely guarded secret in the Empire. Thousands died to keep rebel spies from learning its capabilities. Why should we grant you access to information others cannot even confirm exists?" "Because I have no loyalty to the rebellion," Lex stated flatly. "Because I've proven my value through consistent results. And because if your battle station has a weakness and I could identify it, the enemy eventually will too. Better to discover vulnerabilities now and correct them, than to deploy a weapon and watch it fail when you need it most." He paused, then added with calculated precision, "I've built superweapons before, Lord Vader. I know how brilliant designers become so focused on capability that they overlook obvious points of failure. Pride makes people blind. I have no emotional investment in your Death Star's design, which makes me the perfect auditor. The Dark Lord was silent for a long moment, and Lex felt that invisible pressure brush against his neural shielding again. Vader was testing him, probing not just his mind but his character, seeking any hint of deception or ulterior motive. Lex maintained perfect stillness, letting the shielding do its work, confident that his surface thoughts revealed exactly what he wanted them to show: professional competence, strategic thinking, and absolute commitment to making the Empire's weapons as effective as possible. "The Emperor will decide," Vader said finally. "If he deems you trustworthy enough for such clearance, you will be transported to the facility where the Death Star nears completion. Until then, continue your work on the TIE Advanced project. The prototype has performed well in initial testing. Fleet Command desires a production run." The dismissal was clear, and Lex acknowledged it with a slight bow before withdrawing from the strategy chamber. As he descended through the tower's multiple security checkpoints, he analyzed the meeting's outcome with clinical precision. He had gained recognition, demonstrated strategic thinking, and positioned himself as valuable enough to potentially access the Empire's most critical project. But he had also revealed his philosophical approach, the willingness to embrace overwhelming destructive power as a strategic tool. That revelation could be valuable or dangerous depending on how the Emperor interpreted it. The Force remained his primary unknown variable. Vader clearly relied on it for strategic insights, possibly precognitive abilities that allowed him to anticipate enemy movements. The Emperor reportedly commanded even greater power, though Lex had yet to meet the figure whose will shaped this entire galactic civilization. If the Force truly granted prescience, then everything Lex attempted existed in a surveillance state beyond any technological monitoring. The thought was simultaneously fascinating and infuriating. How could he plan in an environment where probability itself bent toward a mystical energy field's will? The answer came to him as he reached ground level and stepped into Coruscant's eternal day. He couldn't hide from the Force if it functioned as described. But he could become so valuable, so essential to the Empire's continued success, that even precognitive insight into his nature wouldn't justify removing him. He could make himself the most useful asset in the Imperial arsenal, a weapon aimed wherever the Emperor desired, producing results that no amount of mystical power could replicate. Indispensability was its own form of protection. And if the Force truly was an energy field rather than supernatural power, then it could be studied, mapped, and eventually countered. His neural shielding proved that technological solutions existed for at least some Force abilities. With sufficient research, he could develop more comprehensive countermeasures, systems that didn't just block telepathy, but disrupted the Force's manifestation entirely. Imagine that a field generator that created zones where Jedi and Sith became ordinary humans, their powers stripped away, their advantage nullified. The strategic value would be immeasurable. But first, he needed access to more information. He needed to understand how the Force functioned on a fundamental level, what energies it manipulated, what biological or quantum mechanisms enabled its use. The Jedi were nearly extinct, hunted to near extinction by Vader and his Inquisitors, but there had to be records, holocrons, ancient texts that explained their mystical discipline in ways that could be translated into scientific principles. If he could gain access to such information, combine it with his own analytical framework, the possibilities stretched before him like a hyperspace lane leading into unknown territory. Lex smiled as he walked through Coruscant's crowded streets, just another well-dressed human among billions. He had survived the initial insertion, established his value, and positioned himself for deeper integration into the Empire's strategic infrastructure. The next phase would be more challenging, more dangerous, and infinitely more rewarding. The galaxy believed in destiny and prophecy. Lex Luthor believed in superior intellect and calculated risk. Time would reveal which philosophy proved correct. The summons to meet the Emperor arrived 4 months after the strategy session, delivered with such ceremony that Lex knew the moment represented either apotheosis or execution. A shuttle arrived at his laboratory without warning. Its pilot, a royal guard whose crimson armor and force pike marked him as one of the Emperor's personal protectors. Lex followed without question, carrying only a data tablet containing his latest analyses and proposals. If Palpatine intended to kill him, weapons would be irrelevant. If the Emperor desired his service, going armed would be interpreted as distrust. The Imperial Palace occupied territory that had once been the Jedi Temple, a symbolic victory that did not escape Lex's notice. The Empire had literally built its throne room atop the ruins of its predecessor's religious order. Efficiency and ideology combined in one architectural statement. The shuttle landed on a platform restricted to the highest-ranking officials, and Lex found himself escorted through corridors where every surface spoke of wealth and power accumulated beyond reason. These were not functional spaces, these were monuments to dominance. The throne room was darkness made architectural, a vast chamber lit by indirect illumination that cast everything in shades of shadow. At its center, elevated on a platform that required ascending a dozen steps, sat Sheev Palpatine. The Emperor of the Galactic Empire wore simple black robes that somehow conveyed more menace than any amount of ceremonial regalia. His face was ravaged by scars that suggested terrible injury survived through means Lex could only speculate about. But his eyes carried an intelligence that made everything else irrelevant. Those were the eyes of someone who had orchestrated the fall of a 1,000-year government, turned its greatest defender into his personal enforcer, and seized absolute power through manipulation so profound that billions never realized they had been conquered. Lex climbed the steps without hesitation, aware of royal guards positioned throughout the chamber, of Vader standing like a statue at the Emperor's right hand, of security systems that probably tracked his heartbeat and analyzed his stress hormones in real time. He reached the final step and knelt, not out of reverence but because protocol demanded it, and fighting pointless battles wasted energy better spent on meaningful victories. "Rise, Lex Luthor." Palpatine's voice was a rasp that somehow carried perfectly in the vast space. "I have waited with interest for this meeting. Lord Vader speaks highly of your intelligence, though he questions your humility. Mas Amedda praises your technical innovations, though he wonders about your ultimate loyalty. I find myself curious which assessment proves more accurate." Lex stood, meeting the Emperor's gaze with the same directness he had maintained with Vader. Submission invited contempt. Respect without fear demonstrated strength of character. "Both assessments are accurate, Your Majesty. I am intelligent, and I lack false modesty about my capabilities. I am loyal to my own interests, which currently align perfectly with the Empire's success. I see no contradiction in these positions." Palpatine's scarred face split into something that might have been a smile on someone less damaged. Honesty. How refreshing. Most who stand before me profess absolute devotion while their thoughts scream plans of advancement and betrayal. You at least admit your self-interest openly. "Because self-interest is rational," Lex replied. "I gain nothing from the Empire's collapse and everything from its continued strength. I want access to resources, opportunity to pursue research at scales impossible in my home dimension, and the chance to prove that intellect rivals any mystical power in shaping galactic destiny. Those desires make me the most reliable asset Your Majesty possesses, because my loyalty is not based on faith or fear but on calculated advantage." The Emperor leaned forward slightly, and Lex felt something brush against his neural shielding with force that made his earlier encounters with Vader seem gentle by comparison. This was power of an entirely different magnitude, pressure that threatened to crack his technological defenses like a hammer striking glass. He held firm through will alone, refusing to show strain as sweat broke out across his forehead. The presence retreated after a moment, and Palpatine's expression shifted into something closer to genuine interest. "You resist me," the Emperor observed, "not through force sensitivity, but through technology. Fascinating. I had wondered whether your neural shielding represented a true innovation or merely adequate protection against lesser practitioners. Now I see it possesses real merit, though it would not hold against sustained assault. Nothing is perfect, Lex acknowledged, grateful for the chance to catch his breath. But adequacy often proves sufficient. I don't need complete immunity from force intrusion, merely enough protection to maintain mental privacy. My thoughts are my own, Your Majesty. I share them by choice, not by violation. Palpatine settled back into his throne, fingers steepled before his face in a gesture that reminded Lex uncomfortably of his own habitual postures. Lord Vader tells me you wish to audit the Death Star's design specifications. You propose that your intellect might identify vulnerabilities our finest engineers have overlooked. That is either remarkable confidence or dangerous arrogance. It's pattern recognition, Lex said, seizing the opening. I've studied Imperial technology for 10 months now. I've identified consistent design philosophies, emphasis on mass production over individual optimization, focus on intimidation through scale rather than efficiency, preference for organic oversight instead of automated systems. These patterns serve the Empire well in most contexts, but they introduce predictable weaknesses. The Death Star, as I understand it, represents the ultimate expression of Imperial design philosophy, a weapon of such overwhelming power that its mere existence ends resistance. The psychology is sound, but if the execution contains flaws, if there exists some vulnerability that allows a single point of failure to cascade into catastrophic systems collapse, then the entire strategic value disappears. He activated his data tablet, projecting schematics into the air between himself and the Emperor, theoretical designs based on everything he had learned about Imperial engineering, extrapolated to the scale of a moon-sized battle station. I've reconstructed what I believe the Death Star's basic systems architecture resembles. If I'm correct, there are at least 3 potential vulnerabilities that concern me. First, thermal exhaust ports that vent reactor waste directly to exterior hull necessary for cooling but potentially exploitable as access points. Second, power distribution networks that concentrate too much energy through too few conduits, efficient but fragile under sustained assault. Third, command and control systems that rely on organic decision-making at critical junctures. Human judgment is valuable, but it introduces latency and error rates that automated systems avoid. Palpatine studied the projections with attention that seemed to penetrate beyond the technical specifications to something deeper. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that made Lex's instincts scream warnings his conscious mind took a moment to process. You see weaknesses everywhere. You trust nothing that you have not personally designed and verified. This speaks to a mind that has been betrayed, defeated, or at minimum forced to acknowledge limitations it found intolerable. What happened in your home dimension, Lex Luthor, that made you so determined to prove your superiority over all others? The question struck deeper than any Force probe. Lex kept his expression neutral through decades of practice controlling his reactions, but he felt something shift inside him. The Emperor had not asked about his past. He had asked about his trauma. The distinction revealed sophistication that exceeded anything Lex had anticipated from someone whose power rested primarily on mysticism. I lived in a world where a god walked among humans, Lex said quietly. An alien with powers that violated every law of physics I understood, who could rewrite reality through force of will, who was worshipped by billions as the savior of humanity. I watched as people's minds turned to mush in his presence, as rational beings abandoned critical thinking to embrace faith in something beyond their comprehension. I fought him because someone needed to prove that power without accountability corrupts absolutely, that gods should not determine human destiny, that intellect and preparation triumph over brute strength. I lost. Repeatedly. But I never stopped fighting, because the alternative was submission to a cosmic order I found fundamentally unjust. Silence filled the throne room like water pouring into a vessel. Vader remained motionless at the Emperor's side, but Lex imagined he detected some subtle shift in the Dark Lord's posture. Palpatine's expression revealed nothing. Yet Lex sensed that his answer had satisfied something the Emperor needed to understand about his newest asset's fundamental nature. "You are damaged," Palpatine said finally. And it was not quite a question or an observation, but something between them. "This universe's force has touched your mind, found scars where confidence should be, wounds that never properly healed. You came here seeking not redemption but validation. You want to prove that your philosophy deserves victory, even if your home dimension denied you that satisfaction." "Yes," Lex admitted, because denying psychological truth to someone who could read minds seemed pointless. "I want to prove that science defeats superstition, that rational planning outperforms mystical intuition, that human achievement means more than genetic accidents or cosmic energies. If I can demonstrate those principles here, in a galaxy that worships the Force as my world worshipped Superman, then everything I've sacrificed gains meaning." Palpatine rose from his throne with the slow deliberation of someone whose body moved only because will demanded it. He descended the steps toward Lex, and the distance between them collapsed not through physical movement but through some manipulation of perception that made the throne room seem suddenly smaller. The Emperor stopped within arm's reach, studying Lex with eyes that had witnessed the Republic's fall and calculated every move required to achieve absolute power. "The Force is not superstition," Palpatine said softly. "It is the fundamental energy of existence, the current that flows through all living things. But you are correct that it has become a crutch for the weak, a substitute for ambition among those too afraid to seize their own destiny. The Jedi failed because they worshipped the light without understanding the dark. The Sith endure because we embrace power without apology or limitation. You, Lex Luthor, possess the Sith philosophy without the Force to implement it. That makes you either useless or extraordinarily dangerous." He raised one hand, and Lex felt himself lifted from the ground by that same invisible pressure Vader had demonstrated months earlier. But where the Dark Lord's grip had been firm, Palpatine's was absolute. Every muscle locked, every nerve screamed. The sensation was of being caught in machinery designed to crush organic matter into compliance. The Emperor held him there, suspended above the throne room floor, demonstrating power that required no technology, no weapons, no intermediary between will and result. "You will audit the Death Star's design," Palpatine said, voice carrying perfect clarity despite Lex's struggles to breathe. "You will identify vulnerabilities and propose corrections. You will make my ultimate weapon truly invincible, and you will do this knowing that I can extinguish your life with less effort than you spend blinking. Your intelligence is valuable, your independence is tolerable. Your delusion that you might somehow surpass the Force through pure intellect is—" The pressure increased until Lex's vision tunneled toward darkness. "Amusing. Do not mistake amusement for approval, Lex Luthor. You serve the Empire because I allow it. The moment you cease being useful, you cease being anything at all." The invisible grip released, and Lex collapsed to the polished floor, gasping. He tasted blood where he had bitten through his own lip, felt bruises forming across his torso where the Force had compressed flesh against bone. He looked up through watering eyes to find Palpatine return to his throne, expression mild, posture relaxed. Vader remained motionless, neither approving nor disapproving the display, merely present as evidence of what loyalty to Sith power demanded. Lex climbed to his feet with deliberate care, refusing to show weakness even as his body screamed pain. He straightened his suit with shaking hands, met the Emperor's gaze with eyes that carried anger carefully controlled but not entirely suppressed, and forced his voice to remain level as he spoke. "I understand the terms, Your Majesty. I will deliver results that justify your investment in my survival. See that you do." Palpatine replied, dismissing him with a negligent wave. Lord Vader will arrange your transport to the construction facility. You will work under constant supervision. Any attempt to compromise the project results in immediate execution. These are not threats, Lex Luthor. They are descriptions of the consequences your actions will invoke. Lex descended the throne room steps without looking back, maintaining dignity through sheer stubborn will. The royal guards escorted him from the palace, returning him to his laboratory where medical droids waited with Bacta treatments for injuries that shouldn't exist but clearly did. As synth-flesh patches adhered to his bruised ribs, Lex stared at his reflection in a polished wall panel and acknowledged several truths that his pride had resisted, admitting until physical pain forced clarity. The Force was real. Not metaphor, not superstition, but actual manipulable energy that granted its practitioners capabilities beyond current technology. Palpatine commanded power sufficient to kill him whenever convenient, and no amount of neural shielding or technological countermeasures would prevent it. He operated at the Emperor's sufferance, valuable only as long as his contributions exceeded the threat he represented. And his entire philosophy, the supremacy of intellect over mysticism, faced a test against opponents who could reshape reality through concentration and will. But Lex Luthor had never retreated from a challenge simply because victory seemed unlikely. He had fought Superman knowing he would probably lose, built weapons that probably wouldn't work, pursued strategies that probably led to failure. He fought because fighting was the only response to injustice his mind could accept. The Force was impressive. The Emperor wielded it with skill that bordered on artistic, but nothing in existence was truly unbeatable. Everything had limits, weaknesses, points where pressure applied correctly produced catastrophic failure. He would audit the Death Star. He would make it invincible against conventional attack. And he would study its systems with the same intensity he had once studied Kryptonian biology, learning everything the Empire's ultimate weapon revealed about the civilization that built it. Knowledge accumulated over time like compound interest. Eventually, given patience and precision, it exceeded any single advantage an opponent possessed. The Force had ruled this galaxy for millennia. Perhaps it was time someone proved that rule was not inevitable. The construction facility orbited a red giant star in a system so remote that no trade routes passed within 20 parsecs of its location. The Death Star hung in space like a manufactured moon, gray surface interrupted by trenches deep enough to fly capital ships through. Lex's shuttle approached with authorization codes that changed every 6 hours, passing through security checkpoints where any deviation from protocol resulted in immediate destruction. By the time they docked, Lex had counted 17 different opportunities for fatal error, each one a testament to the paranoia that governed the Empire's most critical project. Director Orson Krennic met him in the hangar bay, white uniform immaculate despite the construction dust that coated every surface. The man radiated insecurity masked as confidence, ambition barely restrained by political necessity. Lex recognized the type immediately. Middle management elevated beyond their competence, clinging to position through bureaucratic maneuvering rather than actual achievement. This was someone who could be manipulated. Lex Luthor, Krennic said, voice carrying false warmth. The Emperor speaks highly of your analytical abilities. I trust you understand the sensitivity of this project. Thousands have died protecting its secrets. Those who violate security protocols join them. I have no interest in espionage, Lex replied, following Krennic through corridors that combined military functionality with scale designed to intimidate. I'm here to identify weaknesses and propose corrections. That requires complete access to design specifications, construction logs, and operational parameters. If you restrict my investigation, you compromise its value. Krennic led him to a command center overlooking the battle station's superlaser focusing array, a weapon of such scale that Lex had to recalibrate his understanding of Imperial engineering ambition. 8 separate tributary beams converged into a single output channel capable of generating enough energy to shatter planetary cores. The mathematics required to calculate containment fields, thermal dispersal, and recoil compensation made his mind race with possibilities and concerns in equal measure. The super laser represents the pinnacle of weapons development, Krennic said, pride evident in his voice. A single shot can destroy any target, regardless of size or defensive capability. It makes the Death Star invincible. Nothing is invincible, Lex corrected, already identifying three concerns in the visible architecture. The weapon generates enormous thermal waste. Where does that energy disperse after firing? Krennic gestured to a schematic displayed on the command center's holographic interface. Through exhaust ports distributed across the battle station's surface. The cooling system cycles billions of liters of coolant through heat exchangers that radiate waste to vacuum, standard procedure for any reactor system this scale. Lex studied the schematic with growing concern, zooming in on the exhaust port network. Small openings, heavily shielded, protected by ray shields that prevented physical intrusion. But the ports themselves connected directly to the reactor core through maintenance shafts too narrow for human access, but large enough for smaller objects. Missiles, torpedoes, anything that could navigate a 2-meter shaft and survive long enough to reach vulnerable systems. These exhaust ports are access points, Lex said flatly. An attacking force that penetrated the outer defenses could exploit them. Krennic shook his head dismissively. Theoretical vulnerability only. The ports are ray-shielded and too small for any meaningful attack. What fighter could navigate a trench system under fire from defensive turbolasers while simultaneously executing precision targeting against a 2-meter shaft? The probability of success is effectively zero. Effectively zero is not actually zero, Lex countered, running calculations in his head. A skilled pilot with exceptional spatial awareness and advanced targeting computers could potentially execute such an attack. If they succeeded, what prevents the resulting explosion from cascading through maintenance shafts directly into the reactor core? The director's expression shifted from dismissive to defensive. Emergency containment protocols, blast doors throughout the shaft system, redundant safety systems designed by the finest engineers in the Empire. You insult their competence with these hypotheticals. I insult no one, Lex said, voice hardening. I identify points of failure so they can be corrected before the battle station enters service. Either provide complete access to design specifications or explain to Darth Vader why you obstructed an Imperial directive. Krennic's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on pale resignation. He activated security protocols that granted Lex access to the Death Star's complete technical database, 17,000 files detailing every system from life support to weapons targeting. Lex absorbed the information through his data tablet, mind racing as he constructed a 3-dimensional model of the entire battle station's architecture. The scale was staggering. The complexity exceeded anything he had encountered in his home dimension, and the flaws, once he knew where to look, appeared with crystal clarity. He spent 3 weeks reviewing the designs, sleeping 4 hours per night, sustaining himself on stimulants and nutritional supplements. The construction crews worked around him as he moved through the battle station's incomplete sections, examining welds, testing connections, questioning engineers whose initial resentment transformed into grudging respect when they realized his questions revealed gaps in their own understanding. Lex found 17 separate vulnerabilities of varying severity, from power distribution inefficiencies to structural weaknesses in landing bay shielding. But the exhaust ports remained his primary concern. He presented his findings to Krennic in a briefing that attracted attention from sector commanders, engineering supervisors, and eventually Darth Vader himself. The Dark Lord arrived without warning, his presence transforming the meeting from technical review to something closer to trial. Lex continued his presentation without acknowledging the shift in atmosphere, displaying schematics that highlighted each vulnerability with accompanying proposals for correction. The exhaust ports represent unacceptable risk, Lex concluded. Current design allows direct physical access to reactor containment systems through maintenance shafts inadequately protected by emergency protocols. I propose 3 solutions. First, reduce shaft diameter to under 1 meter, preventing any explosive ordnance from navigating the full distance. Second, install deflection baffles at irregular intervals that require course corrections too precise for remote guidance systems. Third, implement secondary containment fields throughout the shaft network that activate automatically if breach occurs. These modifications increase construction cost by 0.3% and extend timeline by 2 months. The alternative is deploying a weapon with a fatal weakness that competent enemies will eventually exploit. Krennic started to object, then noticed Vader's attention fixed on the schematics. The director's protest died in his throat as the Dark Lord stepped forward to study Lex's proposed modifications with focus that suggested genuine interest. Long moments passed in silence, broken only by Vader's breathing apparatus. "Your analysis is correct," Vader said finally, voice carrying no trace of pleasure or displeasure. "These vulnerabilities exist. The question is whether they represent realistic threats or theoretical concerns that waste resources addressing improbable scenarios." "That depends on your enemies," Lex replied, meeting Vader's gaze without flinching. "If the rebellion consists solely of disorganized cells with limited resources and training, then yes, these vulnerabilities remain theoretical. But if they possess skilled pilots, advanced targeting systems, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for a single precision strike, then these weaknesses become fatal." He paused, then added with calculated precision, "The Emperor described the Death Star as his ultimate weapon. Ultimate suggests no weakness, no limitation, no scenario where failure becomes possible. If that's the goal, then adequacy is unacceptable. Either make the weapon truly invincible, or acknowledge that it represents a calculated gamble rather than absolute certainty." Vader turned from the schematics to face him directly, and Lex felt that invasive force presence probe against his neural shielding. He held firm, maintaining mental privacy through technology, while his surface thoughts deliberately reflected confidence in his analysis and commitment to Imperial success. After a moment, the Dark Lord spoke again, this time addressing Krennic rather than Lex. "Implement his modifications. Extend the construction timeline. Increase the budget allocation. The Emperor demands perfection, Director. Deliver anything less, and the consequences extend beyond your career." Krennic's face went through those interesting color changes again before he managed a strangled affirmative. Vader dismissed everyone except Lex with a gesture, waiting until the command center emptied before speaking again. When he did, his voice carried a quality Lex couldn't quite identify, not quite approval, not quite warning, something between them. "You serve the Empire well," Vader observed. "Your modifications will save this battle station from destruction that would otherwise be inevitable. Yet I sense you take no joy in this service. You view us as primitives playing with powers we barely understand. You tolerate our mysticism only because you lack the strength to oppose it openly." "I view the Empire as a client," Lex corrected carefully, "one that pays in resources and opportunity rather than credits. My personal opinions about the Force are irrelevant to my professional obligations. I deliver results. How you choose to interpret my philosophical framework doesn't change the quality of my work." Vader circled him slowly, and Lex tracked the movement with peripheral awareness while maintaining forward focus. The Dark Lord was testing him again, probing for weakness or deception, seeking any hint that his service masked treachery. Lex kept his thoughts carefully neutral, his emotional state controlled through meditation techniques learned during years of corporate warfare. "The Emperor believes you can be useful," Vader said after completing his circle. "I remain unconvinced. Your intelligence is formidable, but intelligence without loyalty is merely delayed treachery. The Force shows me your nature, Lex Luthor. You serve yourself above all others. The moment the Empire ceases providing what you desire, you will turn against us with the same precision you currently apply to our benefit. Then ensure the Empire continues providing what I desire, Lex replied simply. I'm not complicated, Lord Vader. I want resources to pursue my research. I want the opportunity to prove that intellect rivals mysticism in shaping destiny. I want recognition for achievements that exceed what others consider possible. Grant me these things, and I'm the most loyal asset you possess. Deny them, and yes, I'll seek other arrangements. That's not treachery. That's rational self-interest, operating predictably. Vader was silent for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the command center exit. He paused at the threshold, voice carrying back over his mechanical breathing. Your honesty is either refreshing or suicidal. I have not determined which. Continue your work. Make the Death Star invincible. And understand that the moment your usefulness ends, I will kill you myself rather than allow you to become someone else's weapon. The door closed behind him, leaving Lex alone with his thoughts and the certainty that he had just survived another test. He returned to the schematics, refining his modifications with fingers that moved across the holographic interface with practiced precision. The Death Star would be invincible when he finished with it. No thermal exhaust ports would provide access to critical systems. No structural weakness would compromise its integrity. No design flaw would allow a lucky shot to destroy billions of credits worth of Imperial engineering. And in the process of making it perfect, he would learn everything about how the Empire approached weapons development, resource allocation, strategic planning, and risk assessment. Knowledge that would prove invaluable when he eventually moved beyond auditing their projects to proposing his own. The Emperor wanted him to serve. Vader expected him to betray them. Both were partially correct. He would serve as long as service advanced his interests, and he would betray them the moment a better opportunity presented itself. But first, he needed to become indispensable. He needed to make himself so valuable that removing him would damage the Empire more than keeping him despite his potential threat. The Death Star represented his opportunity to achieve that status. A weapon of such scale and power that its successful deployment would be attributed partly to his contributions. Legacy, built on making monsters more efficient. Lex smiled as he refined the final modifications. Comfortable with the moral implications of his work, he had never claimed to be a hero. He was a survivor, a builder, a man who refused to accept limitations imposed by others. If that made him a monster, then he was content being the most useful monster in the galaxy. The universe had taken everything from him once. He would not allow it to happen again, no matter what force-wielding tyrants claimed about destiny and prophecy. The Death Star's completion occurred 3 months ahead of the revised schedule, a fact Krennic attributed to superior project management while everyone else recognized Lex's efficiency improvements. The battle station emerged from its construction scaffold like a predator from a chrysalis, weapon systems powered and tested, hyperdrive operational, crew complement loaded and trained. Lex stood in the command center during final systems checks, watching holographic displays confirm that every modification he had proposed functioned exactly as designed. The exhaust ports had been reduced, baffled, and reinforced until they represented no greater vulnerability than any other surface feature. Power distribution followed redundant pathways that prevented cascading failures. Structural integrity exceeded original specifications by 40%. The Empire's ultimate weapon was now truly ultimate, incapable of defeat through any conventional attack vector Lex could imagine. He should have felt satisfaction at the achievement. Instead, he felt only cold assessment of what he had created. This battle station could destroy worlds. It would destroy worlds, as soon as the Emperor identified a target that would maximize psychological impact while minimizing strategic loss. Billions would die to make a political point. The mathematics were elegant. The morality was absent. Lex found himself neither proud nor ashamed, merely observant of his own emotional detachment. The demonstration came 2 weeks after the Death Star achieved full operational status. The target was Alderaan, a peaceful world in the core that had provided quiet support to rebel elements while maintaining official Imperial loyalty. Lex watched from Coruscant as the holonet displayed footage of the battle station emerging from hyperspace, its super laser charging with light that made the surrounding starfield seem dim by comparison. He watched as 8 tributary beams converged into a single lance of energy that struck the planet's northern hemisphere. He watched as Alderaan's crust cracked, mantle boiled, and the entire world fragmented into an expanding debris field that would orbit its sun as a ring of death for the next million years. 2 billion people died in approximately 3 seconds. The psychological impact rippled across the galaxy within hours. Systems that had quietly resisted Imperial authority suddenly discovered enthusiasm for compliance. Rebel sympathizers vanished from public forums. Planetary governors pledged renewed loyalty with fervor that suggested genuine fear rather than political calculation. The Emperor's gamble had succeeded beyond any projection Lex had seen in strategic briefings. The Death Star made resistance futile by demonstrating that no location was safe, no population too large, no sympathy for rebellion worth the price of annihilation. Lex turned from the holonet display and found Darth Vader standing in his laboratory doorway. The Dark Lord entered without invitation, approaching until he stood close enough that Lex could hear the mechanical breathing over the facility's air circulation systems. Neither spoke for a long moment, both watching the holonet replay Alderaan's destruction from multiple angles, analysis overlays calculating the energy release, debris trajectories, and estimated casualties. "You made this possible," Vader said finally. "Your modifications ensured the weapon functioned perfectly. The Empire is stronger because of your contribution. Does that bring you satisfaction?" "It brings me confirmation that my analysis was correct," Lex replied neutrally. The Death Star performed exactly as designed. The strategic goal was achieved with maximum efficiency. From a technical perspective, this represents a complete success. From a moral perspective? Lex turned to face the Dark Lord directly, surprised by the question from someone whose reputation was built on atrocities that made Alderaan seem almost merciful. "I don't pretend to occupy moral high ground, Lord Vader. I'm a weapons designer who understood exactly what I was creating. If you're asking whether I feel guilt over 2 billion deaths, the answer is no. I didn't fire the weapon. I didn't choose the target. I didn't establish the strategic doctrine that made this demonstration necessary. I improved the engineering of a tool that would have existed regardless of my involvement. My contribution changed the weapon's reliability, not its fundamental nature." Vader studied him with that unreadable masked gaze, and Lex wondered what the Sith Lord saw. A fellow monster? A useful sociopath? Someone whose amorality made him more predictable than zealots who believed in causes? Or perhaps something else entirely, recognition that they shared certain philosophical foundations despite approaching power from opposite directions. "The Emperor wishes to meet with you again," Vader said. "Your success with the Death Star has elevated your status considerably. He has projects that require your particular expertise, innovations that will cement Imperial dominance for generations. You should be honored by this recognition." "I am." Lex lied smoothly. "When does he require my presence?" "Now." The Imperial Palace felt different during this second visit, as though Alderaan's destruction had fundamentally altered the space in ways Lex couldn't quite articulate. The royal guards who escorted him through its corridors moved with greater confidence, their formation tighter, their weapons held with casual readiness that suggested recent validation of their purpose. The throne room remained darkness made architectural, But now that darkness carried weight, as though the shadows themselves had learned to press down on organic matter. Palpatine sat on his throne with the satisfaction of someone whose gamble had paid off beyond expectation. The Emperor radiated triumph contained behind political masks, allowing only enough emotion to show that Lex understood he stood before power no longer theoretical but demonstrated on a planetary scale. This was the being who had destroyed the Jedi, subverted the Republic, and now casually erased worlds to make strategic points. This was what ultimate authority looked like when no institutional checks remained to limit its expression. Lex Luthor. Palpatine's voice carried warmth that felt more dangerous than any threat. The architect of invincibility. The man who made my ultimate weapon truly ultimate. The galaxy trembles because of your contributions. How does that make you feel? Professionally satisfied, Lex replied, climbing the throne room steps with measured pace. The Death Star functioned exactly as my modifications predicted. The engineering was sound. The execution was flawless. From a technical standpoint, I'm content with the results. But not from a moral standpoint? Palpatine's question echoed Vader's, and Lex began to suspect this was a coordinated probe rather than coincidental curiosity. I don't operate from a moral standpoint, Your Majesty. I operate from an efficiency standpoint. Alderaan was destroyed to achieve strategic objectives. Those objectives were achieved. The cost was 2 billion lives that mean nothing to me personally. If you're concerned that I might develop a conscience and sabotage future projects, let me assure you that I understand exactly what I'm building and accept the consequences of my work. Palpatine rose from his throne with the slow deliberation that made every movement seem choreographed for maximum dramatic impact. He descended the steps until he stood level with Lex, close enough that the Emperor's scarred face filled Lex's vision. Those eyes, ancient beyond human years, intelligent beyond normal comprehension, studied him with attention that made Lex acutely aware of how vulnerable he remained despite all his technological preparations. You accept the consequences because you believe yourself beyond judgment, Palpatine said softly. You view morality as a construct designed to limit the exceptional, a cage built by the weak to contain the strong. You are correct. Morality is a lie we tell the masses to prevent chaos. But the Force is truth. It shows me your nature, Lex Luthor. I see a man who has fought gods and lost. I see someone carrying wounds that never properly healed. I see potential that could serve the Empire magnificently or threaten it catastrophically, depending on factors even you don't fully understand. Lex held his ground despite every instinct screaming that he should retreat. Then guide those factors towards service rather than threat, Your Majesty. Give me projects worthy of my abilities. Let me prove that intellect rivals the Force in strategic value. I don't want your throne. I don't want to rule the galaxy. I want recognition that my philosophy deserves victory, even if my home dimension denied me that satisfaction. Palpatine smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something that belonged in nightmares. What if I told you that you could have the Force itself? That there exist techniques allowing non-sensitive individuals to manipulate its energies through technology and will? The ancient Sith experimented with such methods, cybernetic enhancements, alchemical modifications, artifacts that channeled power beyond normal biological limits. You could become more than human, Lex Luthor. You could achieve the strength to challenge gods and win. The offer hung in the air like poison disguised as medicine. Lex processed its implications with the same analytical rigor he applied to all critical decisions. Palpatine was not offering a gift. He was offering a trap, a temptation designed to corrupt through the very thing Lex claimed to oppose. If he accepted, he admitted that mystical power exceeded scientific achievement. If he refused, he revealed limits to his ambition that the Emperor could exploit. Either path led to subordination beneath someone who understood manipulation better than anyone Lex had ever encountered. "I appreciate the offer, Your Majesty," Lex said carefully, "but I must decline. My value to the Empire lies precisely in the fact that I achieve results without relying on the Force. If I became just another Force user, I'd lose the unique perspective that makes my contributions valuable. I'd rather remain the galaxy's most dangerous normal human than become a mediocre Sith." Palpatine's smile widened, and Lex realized with sinking certainty that he had given exactly the answer the Emperor wanted. Wise. "You understand that power corrupts, that abilities gained too easily carry hidden costs. Very wise. This is why I trust you more than I trust many who claim absolute loyalty. You at least recognize your limitations and work within them rather than deluding yourself about capabilities you lack." The Emperor returned to his throne, settling into it with the satisfaction of someone who had confirmed a hypothesis. Vader remained motionless at his side, watching the exchange with what Lex imagined was carefully controlled interest. The dynamic between them became clearer, Palpatine as architect of philosophy, Vader as living implementation, both searching for assets that could serve their design without threatening its foundation. "I have a new project for you," Palpatine said, voice returning to business formality. "Something that will make the Death Star seem like a crude prototype. I want you to design a weapon that doesn't merely destroy worlds but renders them permanently uninhabitable. A device that corrupts the Force itself, turning entire star systems into zones where life cannot flourish, and the energies that sustain existence collapse into entropy. Such a weapon would make the Death Star obsolete, unnecessary, a relic of thinking too small. Can you create this for me, Lex Luthor? Can you build a weapon that kills not just populations but the very possibility of life?" Lex felt something cold settle into his stomach. He had built weapons before, devices designed to kill Superman, neutralize metahumans, level cities if necessary. But this was genocide elevated to cosmic scale. This was the murder of potential itself, the erasure of everything a star system might become given time and evolution. This was wrong in ways that his moral relativism struggled to rationalize. And it was also the most fascinating technical challenge he had ever encountered. To weaponize entropy, to corrupt the Force itself, to create zones where the fundamental energies of existence collapsed that required understanding physics at levels no human had ever achieved. It required solving problems that most scientists wouldn't recognize as problems. It required genius so far beyond normal that success would prove his superiority over Force users definitively and permanently. "I can't promise success," Lex said slowly, each word chosen with surgical precision. "This goes beyond anything I've attempted, but I can promise effort. Give me access to whatever resources I need, ancient Sith holocrons, Force artifacts, research data from your most exotic projects. Let me study the Force not as a worshipper but as a scientist. If such a weapon is possible, I'll find the path to its creation. If it's not, I'll tell you why and propose alternatives that achieve similar strategic objectives." Palpatine leaned forward, eyes glittering with anticipation that made Lex's skin crawl. "You will have everything you require. Vader will serve as your liaison to classified projects. Nothing will be withheld from your investigation. Create this weapon, and you'll achieve status beyond any normal human in Imperial history. Fail, and you'll simply return to improving existing systems. There is no downside to attempting the impossible, only potential upside if you succeed." The dismissal was clear, and Lex withdrew from the throne room with steps that remained steady through sheer force of will. As he descended through the palace's multiple security levels, he tried to process what he had just agreed to undertake. Palpatine wanted him to weaponize entropy, to kill the galaxy itself, one star system at a time. The Emperor's ambition exceeded anything Lex had imagined, making his own schemes seem provincial by comparison. This was power mad beyond reason, philosophy elevated to cosmic nihilism, The desire not just to rule but to ensure that nothing could ever challenge that rule through any means, including the emergence of life itself. Lex should have refused, should have recognized the moral event horizon he was approaching and stepped back before crossing it, should have maintained some limit to what he would create regardless of the technical fascination involved. But he had never been good at recognizing limits, had never accepted that some knowledge was better left undiscovered, had never believed that any goal was too ambitious if approached with sufficient intelligence and preparation. He would build Palpatine's weapon. He would unlock the secrets of the Force through scientific analysis. He would prove that nothing in existence exceeded human intellect given enough time and resources. And when he finished, when he held the ability to murder existence itself, then he would decide whether to hand that power to an emperor who would certainly use it, or keep it for himself and discover whether even Sith Lords could be held hostage by someone smart enough to make their worst nightmares real. The galaxy had given him a second chance after his original universe rejected him. He would not waste that chance on moral hesitation or philosophical doubts. He would build the impossible, damn the consequences, and let history judge whether genius justified the atrocities it enabled. After all, he had killed billions already by making the Death Star invincible. What were a few star systems compared to that? 18 months passed in what Lex privately categorized as the most intellectually demanding period of his existence. Vader granted him access to resources that most scientists never learned existed. Sith holocrons containing wisdom preserved from before the Republic's founding, ancient artifacts that predated spaceflight on most civilized worlds, research data from experimental projects so classified that their mere existence constituted treason to acknowledge. Lex absorbed everything with the systematic thoroughness that had once allowed him to decode alien biotechnology, translating mysticism into mathematics with rigor that probably would have offended the ancient Sith who recorded their knowledge in metaphor and symbolism. The Force, he discovered, was not magic. It was an energy field generated by living organisms at a quantum level, mediated by microscopic symbiotic organisms the Jedi had called midi-chlorians. These organisms existed in all life forms at varying concentrations, serving as bridges between biological systems and the quantum foam that underlay reality itself. Force-sensitive individuals possessed unusually high midi-chlorian counts, allowing them to perceive and manipulate quantum probability fields in ways that appeared supernatural, but followed consistent physical laws once you understood the underlying mechanics. The light side represented entropic increase, the natural tendency of systems toward greater complexity and diversity. Life flourished under light influence because it aligned with biological processes that depended on energy flow and information exchange. The dark side represented entropic decrease, the forced organization of chaos into patterns that served specific wills. Sith power manifested through imposing order on quantum probability, collapsing waveforms through pure intention until reality bent to desired outcomes. Neither was good or evil in objective terms, they were simply different approaches to manipulating the same fundamental field. Understanding this changed everything. If the Force was quantum manipulation mediated by biological organisms, then disrupting those organisms would disrupt Force sensitivity. If midi-chlorians could be killed or corrupted at a systemic level, entire populations would lose their connection to the energy field that sustained both life and power. And if you could weaponize that effect, target it at planetary scales, then you could create exactly what Palpatine desired, a weapon that didn't just kill populations but prevented life from ever flourishing again by corrupting the very mechanism through which existence interfaced with fundamental Palpatine, reality. Lex designed the Genesis array in a laboratory buried 3 kilometers beneath Coruscant's surface, working with engineers who didn't understand what they were building, only that their specific components needed to meet impossibly precise specifications. The weapon consisted of 3 primary systems. First, a quantum resonance generator that produced frequencies specifically tuned to disrupt midi-chlorian cellular structures. Second, a hyperspatial projector that broadcast those frequencies across an entire star system through tachyon carriers that bypassed normal space-time limitations. Third, a sustained emission system that maintained the disruption field for approximately one standard month, long enough for all exposed midi-chlorians to either die or mutate into forms that no longer interfaced properly with quantum fields. The effect would be subtle at first. Force-sensitive individuals would lose their abilities as their midi-chlorian counts dropped below functional thresholds. Then normal life forms would begin to deteriorate as the quantum coherence that maintained biological complexity collapsed. Plants would fail to photosynthesize properly. Animals would develop cellular degradation that no medical intervention could halt. Entire ecosystems would spiral into death, not through immediate violence, but through gradual systemic failure that left worlds covered in corpses that never decomposed properly, because even bacteria would lack the quantum coherence to function. It was horrifying. It was elegant. It was the most sophisticated weapon of mass destruction Lex had ever conceptualized. He presented the completed design to Palpatine and Vader in a briefing that took 6 hours to fully explain. The Emperor listened with attention that never wavered, asking questions that revealed understanding far deeper than Lex had anticipated. Vader remained silent throughout, but his presence carried weight that suggested the Dark Lord was analyzing the design for weaknesses, determining whether such a weapon represented a threat to Sith power as much as rebel resistance. "This is extraordinary," Palpatine said when the briefing concluded. "You've weaponized the Force itself, turned the galaxy's fundamental energy into a tool of extinction. This exceeds even my expectations." "It comes with limitations," Lex cautioned, pulling up specifications that detailed the weapon's operational constraints. "The Genesis array requires approximately 48 hours to charge between activations. The quantum resonance generator needs exotic matter for fuel specifically, matter that has been exposed to intense dark side energy for extended periods. The hyperspatial projector cannot penetrate certain anomalies in space-time geometry, black holes, neutron stars, regions where gravitational distortion exceeds specific thresholds, and most critically, the weapon affects all life indiscriminately. You cannot target specific populations while sparing others. Once activated against a star system, everything within that system begins to die." Palpatine's smile suggested he saw no problem with indiscriminate slaughter. "The Death Star already destroys worlds completely. This merely adds permanence to that destruction. A system targeted by the Genesis array becomes a warning written into the galaxy's fabric. Approach Imperial authority with anything less than total compliance, and your entire civilization dies so slowly and completely that not even memory remains." "There's one other consideration," Lex said carefully. "The weapon affects Force-sensitive individuals more severely than normal populations because their higher midi-chlorian counts make them more vulnerable to disruption. If you deployed this weapon near concentrations of Jedi survivors or Sith acolytes, it would kill them first and most thoroughly." Vader spoke for the first time during the briefing, voice carrying undercurrents that Lex struggled to interpret. "You've created a weapon that would kill me. That targets the very power upon which the Empire's hierarchy is built. How do you expect us to trust you with such a device?" "Because I have no desire to kill you, Lord Vader," Lex replied honestly. "I designed this weapon according to the Emperor's specifications. I identified limitations and vulnerabilities that would allow Force users to survive exposure through preparation shielding techniques, using the Force itself to maintain quantum coherence despite the disruption field, meditation practices that reinforce midi-chlorian resilience, even technological countermeasures like specialized life support systems. The Genesis array is formidable, but it's not unstoppable. Nothing I create is unstoppable." That's the difference between my philosophy and mysticism. I acknowledge that every weapon has counters, every defense has breaches, every advantage can be neutralized by sufficiently intelligent opposition. Palpatine studied him with those ancient eyes, and Lex felt the Emperor's presence brush against his neural shielding with force that nearly breached his technological defenses. The probe retreated after a moment, and Palpatine's expression shifted into something that might have been approval if it wasn't so deeply disturbing. "You remain true to your nature," the Emperor observed. "You create magnificent weapons while simultaneously ensuring they can never threaten you personally. This is wisdom most beings never achieve." "Lord Vader, your concerns are noted but unnecessary. Lex Luthor serves himself, which makes him predictable. As long as the Empire provides what he requires, he'll continue building weapons that cement our dominance. The moment we cease being useful to him, he'll already have planned his exit strategy. Honesty of this nature is more valuable than false loyalty that masks treachery." Vader's breathing apparatus cycled several times before he responded. "The Emperor is wise. I withdraw my objections to the Genesis Array's development. But I recommend we construct only a single prototype and maintain strict control over its activation codes. A weapon this powerful should never exist in quantities that allow it to fall into unauthorized hands." "Agreed," Palpatine said. "Lex Luthor, you will oversee the Genesis Array's construction personally. You will implement security measures that prevent its activation without explicit Imperial authorization, and you will ensure that its existence remains classified at the highest possible level. Only those in this room and the Emperor's most trusted advisors will know this weapon exists." "Is this clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Majesty," Lex replied, already calculating how to maintain backdoor access to a weapon whose very existence gave him leverage against beings who could kill him through thought alone. The Genesis Array was constructed in the same facility where the Death Star had taken shape, assembled from components produced across 50 different star systems to prevent any single manufacturing location from understanding the complete design. Lex supervised every step, implementing security protocols that would have impressed paranoid dictators in any universe. The weapon emerged from fabrication as a sphere approximately 200 meters in diameter, its surface covered in exotic sensors and projection arrays that made it resemble an artistic sculpture more than humanity's most sophisticated murder machine. Testing occurred in a system so remote that no civilized species had ever bothered cataloging it. 3 uninhabited planets orbited a dying star, their surfaces barren rock without atmosphere or water. Lex activated the Genesis Array from a command ship positioned at the system's edge, watching through multiple sensor arrays as quantum resonance frequencies washed across planetary surfaces like invisible fire. At first, nothing appeared to happen. The planets remained lifeless as they had been for billions of years. But instruments detected the intended effect immediately. Quantum coherence across the entire system dropped by measurable percentages as fundamental forces that sustained atomic stability began to deteriorate. Lex observed the readings with satisfaction tinged by existential dread. He had just attacked reality itself, forced it to degrade through targeted disruption of the mechanisms that allowed matter and energy to maintain organizational integrity. In 6 standard months, those planets would be slightly less stable at quantum levels than before the weapon's activation. In 6 years, they might begin showing signs of accelerated radioactive decay. In 60 years, they could potentially collapse into exotic matter as atomic bonds failed under the cumulative weight of disrupted quantum fields. He had built entropy as a weapon. He had given the Empire the ability to kill the future. Palpatine praised the test results with enthusiasm that made Lex's stomach turn despite his practiced amorality. Vader remained silent, studying the data with attention that suggested the Dark Lord understood the implications more completely than the Emperor's enthusiasm indicated. And Lex filed away certain observations, technical specifications that could potentially be adapted into countermeasures, design limitations that might be exploited if circumstances ever required neutralizing the weapon, backdoor access protocols that gave him unique control despite all official security measures. The galaxy believed him loyal to the Empire. The Empire believed him predictable through self-interest. Both were correct in limited ways, but Lex Luthor had learned long ago that true power came not from wielding weapons, but from being the only person who fully understood how they worked. He had given Palpatine the ability to murder existence, but he had also ensured that he remained indispensable to that weapon's operation, the only mind in the galaxy who could troubleshoot its inevitable failures or adapt its design to changing strategic requirements. The Force might grant prescience, might allow manipulation of quantum probability, might represent fundamental energies that sustained reality itself. But Lex had just proved that science could weaponize those same forces, could turn mysticism into mathematics and destiny into something that could be calculated, controlled, and ultimately conquered. It wasn't victory yet, but it was validation of the philosophy that had driven him across dimensions and through battles against beings who called themselves gods. He had survived Superman by refusing to accept divine authority. He would survive the Sith through the same principle, refusing to bow even when survival demanded pretending submission. And somewhere, in time that stretched forward like hyperspace lanes into unknown territory, he would find the opportunity to prove that human intellect exceeded cosmic power, regardless of what mystical traditions claimed about the Force. The galaxy called it destiny. Lex Luthor called it a challenge worth accepting. 5 years passed in what Imperial historians would later classify as the Age of Consolidation. The Death Star patrolled the galaxy, enforcing compliance through terror. The Genesis array remained classified at levels that made even its existence a rumor whispered in intelligence circles. Lex continued producing innovations that improved Imperial capabilities while simultaneously ensuring his own indispensability. He had become part of the machine, a component so integrated into its operation that removing him would require extensive restructuring. He should have been satisfied. He had achieved recognition, accumulated resources beyond anything his home dimension offered, proved that intellect rivaled mysticism in strategic value. But satisfaction eluded him because the fundamental question remained unresolved. The Force still governed this galaxy's destiny through beings whose power exceeded technology. Palpatine ruled not because his policies were optimal, but because his Force abilities allowed him to manipulate others with supernatural precision. Vader enforced Imperial law not through legal authority, but through capabilities that made resistance suicidal. The entire hierarchy rested on mystical foundations that Lex's philosophy demanded he challenge. The opportunity came unexpectedly, as opportunities often did. Imperial intelligence intercepted transmissions, suggesting the Rebel Alliance had discovered the Death Star's location and planned an assault. The transmissions were obvious bait, disinformation designed to lure Imperial forces into overcommitting their defensive resources, while the real attack came elsewhere. Lex analyzed the intelligence with growing certainty that something more sophisticated was occurring. The rebels weren't just planning to attack, they were planning to destroy the Death Star itself, despite all his modifications making it theoretically invulnerable. He brought his analysis to Vader in a briefing that occurred 36 hours before the projected attack window. The Dark Lord listened without interruption as Lex detailed his concerns, displaying tactical projections that showed how a coordinated strike might exploit weaknesses Lex had never considered during his original audit. Not engineering vulnerabilities, but operational ones. The Death Star's most critical flaw wasn't its construction but its deployment doctrine, overconfidence born of overwhelming power, complacency that came from never facing serious resistance, arrogance that assumed technological superiority guaranteed victory. The rebels possess intelligence regarding the battle station's operational status, Lex concluded. They know it's currently in orbit above Endor's forest moon. They know the shield generator protecting it is ground-based and vulnerable to commando assault. They know that destroying the generator leaves the Death Star exposed during its charging cycle. This isn't speculation, this is certainty based on the precision of their intelligence gathering. Someone on the inside has betrayed Imperial security. Vader stood from his command throne, rising to his full height with deliberation that made the gesture itself seem threatening. Your analysis aligns with intelligence Lord Sidious received through the Force. The Emperor believes the Rebel Alliance will indeed attempt to destroy the Death Star, but he has foreseen their failure. The Force shows him victory, shows the rebellion crushed, and young Skywalker turned to the dark side. Destiny moves according to plan. Destiny is not a plan, Lex countered, voice hardening despite the danger inherent in contradicting a Sith Lord. It's a narrative constructed after events occur to make random chance seem inevitable. The Emperor's prescience is impressive, but it's not infallible. Force visions show probable futures, not certain ones. If you rely on mysticism instead of proper tactical preparation, you risk disaster that could have been prevented through rational analysis. The temperature in the briefing room seemed to drop despite no actual environmental change. Vader approached until he stood close enough that Lex could see his own reflection in the Dark Lord's mask, a distorted image that captured something true about his position in the Imperial hierarchy. He was tolerated, useful, but ultimately subordinate to beings whose power exceeded his understanding despite all his analytical frameworks. "You presume to lecture me on strategy," Vader said quietly, voice carrying undercurrents that made Lex's survival instincts scream warnings. "You, who have never felt the Force, never understood the currents of destiny that flow through every moment. The Emperor's vision is absolute. We will deploy according to his design. Your concerns are noted and dismissed." Lex held his ground through sheer, stubborn will, meeting Vader's gaze with eyes that refused to show the fear his biochemistry was currently flooding his system with. "Then at minimum, allow me to be present during the engagement. Position me on the Death Star where I can monitor systems and respond if anything deviates from expectations. I designed many of those systems personally. If problems emerge, I'm the most qualified person to troubleshoot them." Vader was silent for a long moment, then turned and walked from the briefing room without acknowledgement or dismissal. Lex took that as permission, or at least absence of refusal, which amounted to the same thing when dealing with Sith authority. He made arrangements to transfer to the Death Star, packing equipment that included far more sophisticated sensors and analysis tools than would be necessary for routine systems monitoring. If the battle went poorly, he intended to gather data that might explain how supposedly invincible weapons failed when confronted by enemies desperate enough and skilled enough to find impossible solutions. The Death Star hung above Endor like a mechanical moon, its gray surface reflecting the gas giant's banded atmosphere in patterns that appeared almost organic. Lex established himself in a monitoring station adjacent to the super laser control room, surrounded by displays showing every critical system simultaneously. Imperial forces had deployed according to the Emperor's strategy fleet, assets positioned to ambush rebel ships when they emerged from hyperspace. Ground forces protecting the shield generator with overwhelming superiority, the Death Star itself fully operational and ready to demonstrate its power when the Emperor gave the signal. It was a perfect trap, too perfect. Lex's instincts, honed through decades of corporate warfare and strategic planning, screamed that perfection itself represented a vulnerability. Overconfident enemies made mistakes. Overconfident defenders never anticipated the creative solutions desperation inspired. He monitored his displays with focus that never wavered, tracking fleet movements, shield integrity, power distribution, searching for any deviation from expected parameters. The Rebel fleet arrived exactly on schedule, emerging from hyperspace in a formation that suggested they had indeed fallen for the Emperor's trap. Lex watched as Imperial Star Destroyers moved to engage, their superior numbers and firepower promising to annihilate the smaller rebel force within standard engagement timeframes. But something felt wrong. The rebels weren't retreating or attempting to jump back to hyperspace. They were committing fully to an assault that seemed suicidal unless they possessed information that changed the tactical calculus. Then the shield generator failed. Lex's displays erupted with warnings as the protective field that made the Death Star invulnerable collapsed completely. His fingers flew across controls, analyzing the failure mode, searching for technical explanations. But the data told a story of sabotage rather than malfunction. Explosive charges, carefully placed at critical power junctions, demolition so precise that it suggested expert knowledge of Imperial defensive architecture. The ground assault had succeeded despite overwhelming Imperial superiority. The rebels had somehow overcome defenses that should have been impenetrable. The Emperor had miscalculated, or perhaps the Force had shown him one probability while reality manifested another. Either way, the Death Star now hung in space without its primary defensive system, exposed to attack for the first time since its commissioning. Lex opened a communication channel to the command bridge, where Vader presumably monitored the engagement. "Lord Vader, the shield generator has fallen. The Death Star is vulnerable. I recommend immediate tactical withdrawal to..." "The Emperor's plan proceeds," Vader's voice cut across his warning. "Young Skywalker is aboard this station. The trap is not for the rebel fleet but for him. All else is secondary to turning the Jedi to the dark side." The communication terminated, leaving Lex staring at displays that showed rebel starfighters penetrating the Death Star's superstructure despite defensive turbolaser fire. The battle had devolved from planned ambush into chaotic melee, exactly the scenario where superior numbers and firepower became liabilities instead of advantages. He pulled up structural schematics, tracking the rebel fighter trajectories, calculating their probable objectives. They were heading for the reactor core. They had somehow obtained detailed interior maps. They knew where to strike to cause catastrophic damage. And Lex realized with sinking certainty that they possessed those maps because he had created them. His modifications to the Death Star's systems required comprehensive documentation, schematics filed in databases that were supposedly secure but clearly had been compromised. The very improvements that made the weapon invincible against conventional attack had provided the intelligence necessary for unconventional assault. His brilliance had created the means of his own work's destruction. The irony would have been funny if billions of credits and Imperial strategic superiority weren't about to explode in a reactor failure that would fragment the battle station into debris. He abandoned his monitoring station, running through corridors that shook with impacts from rebel fire. Emergency alarms blared throughout the structure, evacuation protocols activated too late to save the thousands of personnel who would die when the Death Star's reactor lost containment. Lex reached an escape pod bay, found it crowded with officers and technicians fighting for access to limited survival craft. He forced his way through the crush of bodies with elbows and aggression, learned in corporate boardrooms that resembled combat zones, claiming a pod through sheer ruthless determination. The escape pod launched just as the Death Star's superstructure began its final convulsion. Through the viewport, Lex watched as internal explosions tore through the battle station's incomplete sections, chain reactions racing toward the reactor core with velocity that matched his worst calculations. The superlaser flickered once as power fluctuated, then died completely as critical systems failed. The entire structure seemed to hang, suspended for a moment, caught between operational status and oblivion. Then the reactor exploded, and the Death Star ceased to exist. The blast wave caught Lex's escape pod, spinning it through space like debris. Emergency systems activated, stabilizing the small craft's trajectory, but not before he caught glimpses of the devastation through the viewport. The Emperor's ultimate weapon had become an expanding sphere of vaporized metal and radiation, a funeral pyre for thousands of Imperial personnel, and the strategic doctrine that assumed overwhelming force guaranteed victory. The Empire's invincible weapon had died, and with it died the certainty that technology alone could overcome enemies desperate enough and skilled enough to exploit human overconfidence. Lex strapped himself into the pod's acceleration couch, pulling up sensor displays that showed the larger battle still raging across Endor's orbital space. The Super Star Destroyer Executor had crashed into the Death Star during its death throes, adding a second catastrophic loss to the engagement. Imperial forces were withdrawing in disorder, their command structure shattered, their morale broken by watching their ultimate weapon destroyed, despite every assurance that such an outcome was impossible. The rebels had won, not through superior firepower or overwhelming numbers, but through creativity, determination, and the willingness to risk everything on a desperate plan that succeeded despite probability suggesting it should have failed. They had done what Lex himself had once attempted: defeated seemingly invincible power through intelligence, precision, and refusing to accept that some victories were impossible. He felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he struggled to identify because it resembled respect. These rebels, these desperate fanatics fighting against an empire that outgunned them 1,000 to 1, had accomplished what he had failed to achieve in his home dimension. They had killed a god, or at least killed the weapon that made gods seem invincible. The metaphor wasn't perfect, but it struck close enough to old wounds that Lex found himself contemplating his own philosophy with more skepticism than he had allowed in years. Had he been wrong? Not about the force that remained mysticism that required challenging, but about the supremacy of intellect over determination, about the value of technical perfection versus adaptive improvisation, about the assumption that being smarter than your enemies guaranteed victory regardless of their motivation or resourcefulness. The Death Star had been invincible in technical terms. Its destruction proved that technical invincibility meant nothing against enemies who refused to accept impossibility as constraint. The escape pod drifted through space as recovery operations began, Imperial shuttles collecting survivors from the debris field. Lex activated his emergency beacon, marking his position for retrieval, and settled back to wait. He would survive this. He always survived. The question was whether survival justified the compromises he had made, the weapons he had built, the philosophy he had defended against evidence that perhaps genius without wisdom was just elaborate delusion. The galaxy believed in the Force. Lex Luthor believed in superior intellect. The rebels believed in freedom and hope. Which philosophy deserved victory? Which worldview shaped reality more truly? The Force had failed to protect the Death Star. Lex's modifications had failed to prevent its destruction, but the rebels' conviction that they could win despite impossible odds had carried them to victory. Perhaps belief itself was a force more powerful than mysticism or technology. Perhaps conviction shaped destiny more than prophecy or calculation. Perhaps he had been fighting the wrong battle since arriving in this galaxy, challenging mysticism when he should have been examining the foundations of his own certainty that intellect exceeded all other forms of power. An Imperial shuttle locked onto his beacon, moving through the debris field to collect him. As its docking collar sealed against his escape pod, Lex prepared himself for the debriefings that would follow, the questions about what went wrong, the analyses of how an invincible weapon became vulnerable. He would answer truthfully, because lying gained nothing when the evidence floated as wreckage across an entire orbital zone. But privately, he would contemplate the more important question: what did he do now that his contributions to Imperial strategy had proven insufficient? What path remained for someone whose philosophy demanded he challenge mystical power, yet who had just watched that power's primary weapon destroyed despite everything his genius had done to prevent such an outcome? The answer came to him as the shuttle's interior lights illuminated the escape pod's cramped space. He would do what he had always done. He would survive, adapt, and find new ways to prove that intellect shaped destiny regardless of temporary setbacks. The Death Star's destruction was not proof that his philosophy was wrong. It was proof that he had not yet pushed far enough, not yet developed technologies sophisticated enough to challenge the Force directly rather than serving those who wielded it. He would learn from this failure. He would extract every lesson the battle offered, and he would emerge stronger, smarter, more dangerous than before. Because that was what survival demanded, and Lex Luthor had never failed to survive no matter what universe tried to break him. The Force might be impressive, but it had not killed him yet. And as long as he lived, he represented a threat to any power that claimed supremacy through mysticism rather than earning it through demonstrable results. The game had changed, but it was far from over. The Empire fragmented after the Death Star's destruction and the Emperor's death at the Battle of Endor. Lex learned of Palpatine's demise through intelligence reports that described a confrontation between father and son, a redemption arc where Darth Vader turned against his master to save Luke Skywalker. The poetry of it offended Lex on fundamental levels, the idea that love conquered power, that emotional connection trumped tactical superiority, that the galaxy's fate hinged on personal drama rather than strategic competence. It was embarrassing, it was irrational, and it perfectly illustrated why mysticism remained humanity's greatest weakness. Vader died shortly after killing the Emperor, his life support systems too damaged to sustain him without Force-assisted concentration. The Dark Lord's last act was apparently removing his mask to see his son with his own eyes, a gesture so sentimental that Lex could barely process it as something a being that powerful would prioritize. The man who had terrified star systems, enforced Imperial law through casual violence, and represented the Emperor's absolute authority, had died because he chose emotional closure over survival. Weakness. Pure weakness that validated everything Lex believed about the Force's corruption of rational thinking. With both Sith Lords dead, the Imperial hierarchy collapsed into warlordism. Sector governors declared independence, fleet commanders divided the Navy into competing factions. The galaxy that had been united under authoritarian rule for decades splintered into chaos that the Rebel Alliance, now calling itself the New Republic, lacked the strength to properly govern. Lex observed the disintegration from a secure location on Coruscant, monitoring holonet transmissions that showed celebrations in some systems and panic in others as the infrastructure that maintained order dissolved. He had survived the transition through careful positioning and useful skills. The various Imperial remnants all needed technological expertise, and Lex possessed knowledge that made him valuable to multiple factions. He played them against each other with the practiced ease of someone who had conducted corporate warfare across dimensional barriers, extracting concessions and resources in exchange for innovations that kept whichever warlord he currently worked for slightly ahead of their competitors. But survival without purpose was just delayed death. Lex needed an objective, a goal that justified his continued existence in this galaxy. The Empire was gone, the Force remained, and somewhere in the transition between authoritarian order and chaotic freedom, opportunity existed for someone smart enough to recognize it. The opportunity revealed itself 6 months after Endor, when Lex intercepted transmissions suggesting the New Republic had established a Jedi training academy. Luke Skywalker, the farm boy who had destroyed the Death Star, was apparently gathering Force-sensitive individuals and teaching them the mystical traditions that the Empire had spent decades trying to eradicate. The New Republic celebrated this development as evidence that hope and light had returned to the galaxy. Lex saw it as confirmation that nothing fundamental had changed. The Force still dominated strategic thinking. Mysticism still trumped rational analysis. The galaxy had merely replaced one set of space wizards with another. He began planning immediately, constructing a strategy that would take years to fully implement, but promised results worth the investment. He would infiltrate the Jedi Academy, not as a student, his lack of Force sensitivity made that impossible, but as a technological consultant. The New Republic needed infrastructure, weapons, defensive systems, Lex possessed expertise in all those areas and could provide services valuable enough that even Jedi would accept his presence, despite his philosophical opposition to their entire worldview. Once inside their organization, he would study the Force from unprecedented proximity. He would analyze their training methods, examine how they manipulated quantum fields, document the biological and neurological processes that enabled their abilities. He would gather data that no Sith holocron contained because the Sith had never approached the Force as a scientific phenomenon requiring rigorous study. They had embraced it as mystical power to be wielded rather than understood. And when he finally comprehended how the Force functioned at fundamental levels, when he had mapped its mechanisms completely, then he would do what he had attempted in his home universe. He would build technology that neutralized supernatural power, that reduced space wizards to ordinary humans, that proved intellect exceeded mysticism regardless of what ancient traditions claimed. He would demonstrate that the Force was impressive but not supreme, powerful but not invincible, and that any phenomenon could be countered through sufficient understanding and technological sophistication. The Genesis array had proved he could weaponize the Force itself. His neural shielding demonstrated that Force abilities could be blocked. The next step was creating comprehensive countermeasures, systems that didn't just defend against specific abilities but suppressed Force manifestation entirely within defined zones. Imagine fortresses, ships, entire planets where Jedi and Sith became ordinary humans, their powers stripped away, their advantage nullified. The strategic value would be immeasurable, the philosophical validation would be complete. Lex smiled as he refined his plans, fingers dancing across holographic interfaces with the practiced precision of someone who had built empires before and would do so again. The Empire had fallen, but he remained. The Sith had died, but he endured. The galaxy believed itself free from authoritarian rule, but Lex understood that freedom was illusory without the means to defend it, and defense ultimately rested on technology rather than mystical traditions that failed whenever pressure exceeded their practitioners' capabilities. He would join the New Republic's reconstruction efforts. He would make himself indispensable to their infrastructure. He would position himself close enough to their Jedi to study them thoroughly. And when he had learned everything he needed to know, when his understanding of the Force exceeded even their mystical wisdom, then he would demonstrate that Lex Luthor's philosophy deserved victory regardless of what temporary setbacks suggested. The Force had ruled this galaxy for millennia. Perhaps it was time someone proved that rule was not inevitable, that destiny could be overwritten through sufficient intellect and determination, that the future belonged not to those blessed by cosmic energies, but to those brilliant enough to understand and ultimately control those same forces. He had survived Superman. He had survived the Empire. He would survive the Force itself, and emerge from that survival with proof that human genius exceeded any power the universe could manifest against it. The galaxy called it destiny. Lex Luthor called it a challenge worth every resource he possessed. And he possessed considerable resources indeed. The war was not over. It had merely entered a new phase. One where the battles would be fought not with superweapons and fleets, but with knowledge, understanding, and the patient application of genius to problems others considered mystical rather than solvable. Lex Luthor had come to Star Wars through a dimensional rift beyond his control. He would leave his mark on this galaxy through choices very much within it. The Force would learn what humanity's greatest mind could accomplish when properly motivated. And the galaxy would learn that prophecy meant nothing to someone who refused to accept any future except the one he deliberately created.